Hello, everyone, and welcome back to sunny southeast London for my second little chat to you all about really nerdy things.
Really nerdy things.
Really nerdy
this time.
things. Once again, we have the lovely Georgia, who's here
Hi.
to basically ask all the questions that I forgot that might need asking, and to ask me to explain things that I haven't already explained. So thank you very much
You're so welcome.
for doing that. Right. So I guess we'll just dive straight in. And what we're going to be looking at today, a very short introduction to notation. That's quite a woolly title. Well, what I mean really is we're going to be looking at a history of notation, or rather the very early history of notation, from the beginnings of polyphony, of writing down of polyphonic music, up to about 1600. Now, what do I mean by writing down polyphonic music? Well, by polyphony, I'm talking about music that's in more than one voice at once. So monophony is the opposite of that, and that is like chant. It's one line going on at once, and polyphony is when you have more than one line going on at once. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, a basic overview of the history of polyphonic notation. Now, we're going to go quite deep. It's going to get quite nerdy. So buckle in, and hopefully I'll be able to explain things in a clear enough way that you might get some interest out of it. So we're going to be looking at everything from the early sources of polyphony in the beginning of the 10th century and the end of the 9th century. We're going through the process of them turning words into notation, into neumes, into notes, and then what those notes mean in terms of rhythm as well as pitch as well. And then when we go towards the end of the period, we're getting into white note notation, which is slightly more sort of codified in its rules and its regulations. So we're going to talk about a little bit about those, and then we're going to finish off with a little proportion exercise at the end. If those words mean nothing to you so far, don't worry. I'm going to explain it all as we go along, and hopefully you'll understand.
Good.
I've just got a little timeline here of the period that we're looking at from the 10th century, from 900. We got some early medieval and mid-medieval notation. This is sort of what you might call pre-note heads notation. I'll show you what that means in a second. That moves into square notes, where things are starting to have a sense of rhythm as well as pitch, and then we move in through different types of rules around the notation and what it means, through Franconian notation, and then into French notation. French notation is kind of a misnomer of a term because most of this stuff previously has originated from France anyway, but that's just to distinguish it from the Italian notation at the same time. Which we are not going to look at today. It's a very big and very interesting topic, but it's slightly tangential to this particular timeline. So we're going to park that for today and might come back to it in a later session. And then in the middle of the 15th century, things change quite a lot in sort of visually. So we're going to then look at how the white note notation comes in, and because that's slightly more clarified in terms of its rules, then we're just going to talk a bit more about the rules around that, mensuration, coloration, and proportion as well. Again, as I said, if those words mean nothing to you at the moment, don't worry.
They will.
They will. So we start in the medieval period, in the 10th century, the 9th century, the very end of the 9th century. And this is here one of the first manuscripts that we have that shows music being written down in more than one part. This is a treatise called Musica Enchiriadis. What that basically is it's kind of like a research paper or a discussion paper these days, and it's mostly text, but it has got lots of examples of polyphonic music written down in it. So if we look at this example that I've got here on the right, hopefully you can see the cursor I've got up this week. You can see here that we've got what will become a staff. We've got lines drawn across the page. Now each of these lines will correspond to a note. Not like in the current system where it's a line and a space correspond to two notes. The lines all correspond to one note each. And these notes are clarified on the left of the system there by these squiggles. And those are derived from ancient Greek and are called a dacia system. So each of those individual symbols has a particular note attached to it. And you can see along the bottom here what those notes these days translate into. And I've just drawn, I'm just going to get me out of the way, I've just drawn the scale which that creates at the bottom here in modern notation. There's a couple of interesting things you might see about this scale here. The first thing is, if you look at this B flat here, well, the octave above that is a B natural. That's an augmented octave. That's a slightly funny thing. These days we're used to having octaves which have the same note at either end of them, but this is an augmented octave. And likewise, between this C here up to this F sharp, that's a tritone. That's something you don't hear in modern scale, but you do get in this scale. And it comes out with quite an interesting sound world. So I'm just going to play a little bit of this now. I'm hoping that you're going to be able to hear this, but for some reason this clip, they sing it 3 times, or rather the clip runs 3 times, but it's the same thing either time. So here we go. Well, there you go. That's an idea of how that works. It's some pretty basic parallel motion.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Thank you.
There's a lot of logic there.
Good. As we move into the 11th century, there's a number of different ways that music is starting to be written down in polyphony, and this is an example. It's now in the Bodleian Library in Oxford of a bit of music here. Now, it's quite jumbled up, so it's quite difficult to see, but there is a text along here, and that's this word here, ut, then tuo, pro, propitiatus. There, ut tuo propitiatus. That's our text line, and then above it we have 2 lines of note names here. Now, these you might see don't relate exactly to the A to G note names that we have in these days. They actually don't go around the top, as it were, and don't cycle back from G to A. They keep going. And so in this transcription we've got over on the right here, you see lots of H's, K, L, even an I, all those sort of things. And that's all note names. Note names for to correspond to the text. And you can see the transcription below as well. That gives us an idea of those 2 voices. You'll also notice that that's in comparison to the first example, where the words have both meaning for the words themselves, but also for the pitches. Here, we've separated them into what what is more common today, of the words being separate from the pitches that they are supposed to be sung on. So that's an interesting little diversion there. This doesn't happen very much or for very long. It happens in some German lute music as well, but we then get into what you might have seen before, and we get into the neumes. The neumes. This is
my favourite bit.
This is a manuscript, a really important manuscript from the early 11th century, called the Winchester Troper. It was originally written for use in Winchester Cathedral, and has a huge collection, probably the earliest of the large collections of polyphony. This is 2-part organa, and we're going to talk about what organa are in a minute. You can see here that we have the text written here in Latin, as most things were by this stage, and then these squiggles above, they're neumes. Now, what these mean, these aren't so much prescriptions for notes. They're actually more an aide-memoire for the singers. The singers would have learnt these tunes, these melodies, by heart from their seniors, and it would be passed down through the generations that were singing this stuff. But these lines here were just served as an aide-memoire to the singers. So not, unlike in the first example, not each of these symbols means a single note. These actually mean a collection of notes. So here we might go down and then up a little bit. Here it might just go straight up. Here we might go up and then come down more quickly. These will become something in the next chapter, but at the moment they're just sort of an aide-memoire. And they're also what are called chironomic neumes. What that word means is they're staffless. They don't have lines across the page which they sit on to give a definite pitch. They are sort of floating on the page. That's as opposed to diastomatic neumes, which are on a staff. So these aren't definite pitches, nor are they definite rhythms. The rhythm is given by the words rather than by the notes at this stage. And as we can see again, the symbols are separate from the pitch. From the pitches are separate from the words of which they're to be sung. For example, of the other kind of neumes, I talked about chironomics, and this is diastomatic neumes. And no survey of the early medieval period will be complete without a trip to Limoges and to see Saint Martial. Now, you can't really see in this facsimile here, but there's lines are scratched on the surface of the vellum here. This is vellum. It's probably vellum. It looks like it's vellum. Probably the skin of a calf or something like that.
Very nice.
And on it is scratched some lines. So these neumes, each of these are separate neumes now. They are actually giving some sort of idea of definite pitch. And you can see here on the left-hand side here that we got starting to get clef. So this here is a C and that's a G. And so we can see the lines here actually starting to mean note names like you would get these days.
Is that just lines or lines and spaces?
I think at this point it's lines and spaces.
Okay, good to know.
So this is also in two parts. The first part goes here, and it's divided from the second part, which is here, by this red line, and which has obviously been drawn well within the lines.
Yeah, they really planned that.
And then
well.
then the text goes along at the bottom. So we have a system here, and we have a system here. And you can see that while these notes don't have any rhythmic value in themselves, you can see that because the lower system, the lower staff here, the lower voice, has far fewer notes than the upper voice does, he's going to have to sing them more slowly. The upper voice is going to have to sing them more quickly. And you can hear what that sounds like when I play this example. So we're going to go from the beginning of this. This is Viderunt Emmanuel Patri Unigenitus, probably, or Unigenitum. And we're going to start with the incipit from the lower voice, which is just these four notes, and then start again here. And you can see, I'll follow the top part along with the cursor. You can see how this fits together. And off we go, off the end of the page. So as you can see there, that in this space, for example, we have to fit in all of these notes. Now they're not like you would have these days. This isn't all happening at the same time.
That's what I'd originally thought. That's how I read it.
No, it's like we have to go along like a snake, like this, and then down again, and up, and so because we're in a format which means that we can see both parts at the same time moving along together, we know as a lower voice, for example, that we have to wait to fit in all these notes in the upper voice, and that's what we call contrapuntal coincidence. Now, as we leave the medieval period, or move on to the very end of the medieval period, these neumes are starting to become more clear in what they in their sort of shape, and you can see here what those neumes that I showed you from the Winchester Troper, what these things will turn into here, which are squares. And this is the end of the 12th century. Now, the 12th century, the end of the 12th century is a really important time in the history of polyphony generally, and also of notation. Not mostly, but not entirely, but mostly because Notre Dame was built in the 12th century and was mostly finished by 1190. And Paris then became one of the centres of learning and of innovation. The church was probably the primary provider of education at the time. And along with that comes a shift from anonymous and collective composition to a much more individual and personal attribution. There's two names you might have heard of this period called Léonin and Peritin. Well, they are possibly the first, almost certainly the first, proper sort of composers to be named in writings of the time. They were named by an English traveller and writer called Anonymous IV. So we obviously found their name is far more interesting than his own.
Clearly.
But Léonin and Peritin were the biggest contributors to what is called the Notre Dame School of Polyphony, and that is what we have here. There's three main sources of the Notre Dame repertory in the late 12th century. There's one that's now in a library in Florence, which we call F, and there are two others which are held in a library in Germany in Wolfenbüttel. One is from St Andrews and one's from somewhere else, I can't remember where.
From where, sorry?
St Andrews.
Oh, what a lovely university. Please continue.
Georgia is an alumna of St Andrews. Although the university wasn't founded until 200 years after this period. But
no
anyway.
one needs to know that. Carry on.
So this is F that we're looking at on the right here. And it's quite a small volume. And it's incredibly ornate. This initial letter here, which is a V, uses up a huge amount of pigment for the time. Pigment is obviously very expensive for that time, and this happens on almost every page. That there's a big initial like this. Well, not almost every, but a lot of pages. And it's also quite small and would have been quite hard to read in the darkness of Notre Dame. So it's probably not a book to be used in practical use, in practical services. Now I'm just going to skip over this and then come back to it because I wanted to talk about the repertory of Notre Dame. It sort of divides into four genres. The first is organa. There's that word again. What does organa mean? Well, it's based on plainsong, on Gregorian chant, and then you have a certain number of voices that sit above that chant, physically above on the page, above that chant, and by now the chant is basically then elongated to an extreme extent over a very, very long period of time, just holding single syllables and single notes, whereas the voices on top then weave around a very melismatic, so same one single syllable but lots of notes in that single syllable. And they weave around all on top of that, sort of embellishing the plain chant. And if you have two voices, so if we had, this is the tenor on the bottom here. There's 1, 2, and 3 notes. Not an awful lot for the tenor to do in this particular page. But if we just had him and the one voice above, that would be organa dupla. If we had that and two voices above, that would be organa tripla. And then in this example, there's 3 voices above, so that is organa quadrupla. And there was a complete cycle of this for the church year that was written by the earlier Leoninus, and then this was expanded with the quadrupla and some more tripla added by Peritin, who is the generation below Léonin. Then from that we get clausulae. Now clausulae are short snippets, largely but not entirely in organa dupla, which are also based on plain chant tenors. But they're short snippets, and there's often a number of these to a page on the same word, a number of different options, if you like, and they're used to sort of substitute in sections of the complete organa.
Can I interrupt for a quick question?
Sure.
From Terry, who asks if all of these musical texts that we are using are religious in nature, or if there are any secular texts, like folk songs, for example, that have the same notation history.
Right. Well, at this point, we're talking about church music, particularly when it comes to Notre Dame. As you'll see, it gets away from that slightly later, this is what's going to happen in a moment. So I'm going to get to that. Thank you, Terry. So after the clausulae, then comes the conductus. I'd say after they came up sort of simultaneously, but it's a different genre. The conductus. Now, this is where the previous organa and clausulae have been based on liturgical texts, not just religious, but liturgical texts and church texts for use in the church service. The conductus has texts of Latin poetry, normally addressed to the Virgin, or sometimes some other saint as well. And the view of the liturgical text was that because they were in a way transcendent and they were unable to be understood perfectly by humans, then there was no need for particular clarity from the singers when they were singing the text. So that is why you get these words spread over such a long period of time. Well, with the conductus, because the texts are non-liturgical and they're poetry, they are intended therefore to convey a message to the audience, much like a sermon might be. Then they become more syllabic, so they become more comprehensible to the audience. And then finally, at the end of this period, we get into the 13th century. We get the motet, which is based on the clausulae. There's been a little bit of back and forth with scholars about whether the motet came from the clausulae or some other way around. But for these purposes, I'm going to say that the motet comes from the clausulae, and where the upper voices have a long syllable on which they sing many notes. In the clausulae, in the motet, they have a full text, and that can be in Latin or, Terry, in French. And sometimes the French is sacred, sometimes it's not. So sometimes this will be for the church, sometimes it will be for the pub.
Excellent.
Later on in the period, not right at the beginning. Now, as well as these looking slightly cleaner, these note heads now have a rhythmic value. And actually, before I explain that, I'm going to go and play you the opening of this Viderunt Omnes, this organa quadrupler. I'm just going to play the first page, which is about 2 minutes of music, and I'm going to follow along the middle part here with the cursor. And you can see now that because the words are split out over such a long period of time, the notes now have their own rhythmic value. So see what you can make of this. And over the page we go.
I feel really, really sorry for the tenor part in that.
In that recording, they had an organ helping them, which is a bit of a cheat, I think. But anyway.
That is cheating.
Right. So we saw there that these notes now have a rhythm to them. Well, how do we know that how do we know what that means? There is a system, and I'm just going back here for a second. You see these vertical strokes here between sections of ligatures. Then they're called This section here is called an ordo between the lines. You might think of it kind of a little bit like a bar or a measure. It's not strictly speaking a bar, but for the purposes of today, we'll call it a bar. It's an ordo, and the notes then are collected together in ligature. So 1, 2 notes there, 1, 2 notes there, physically connected by a line. And the organisation of the ligatures is what is important for the rhythm. So if we take this first example here, we have an ordo which has a ligature of 3, a ternary ligature, followed by binary ligatures. So it's 3 followed by lots of 2s. That translates to a long-short pattern. Bum, ba bum, ba bum, ba bum, ba bum, ba bum. Or an iambic pattern if you want to do it from a sort of linguistic point of view. Mm-hmm. The reverse would be mode 2. These are rhythmic modes. Is what I'm talking about. Rhythmic modes. Mm-hmm. So lots of 2s, and then ending with a ternary with a 3 would be the trochaic foot. So short, long, ba bum, ba bum, ba bum, ba bum, ba bum, bum, and then so on and so forth. You don't need to know the rest of those right now. It's just interesting to have a look.
Can I just clarify?
Yeah.
Because resident music idiot. Hello.
Hi.
So are these like keys? Like, you know, when you're cracking a code, right?
Oh yes, that sort of key.
You have a key to crack the code.
Yeah, not like a musical key.
Not like a musical key. No. So whatever happens within that first little section tells you for the rest of the ordo, preface to the bar.
Right.
What is going to happen? Like how that should be played? Is that what you're?
Yeah, you kind of have to look at the whole ordo before you sing it, and then
right.
that tells you what the rhythm is supposed to be.
Right.
Yeah.
That does.
You can see the deficiencies in the system, but it was a big breakthrough for the time.
Okay.
In terms of measuring out music.
Thank you very much. Sorry, everyone. Carry on.
So we have a system of longs and shorts. In Latin, there's lots of Latin in this talk. It becomes the longa and the brevis.
Hey!
I think we're going to get somewhere with this.
We know where we're going.
So as we turn the corner of the 13th century and we go into through the 13th century up to the 14th, we get into the era of Franco and Franconian notation. Now, as a sort of bridge between the two, we're going to look at this manuscript, which is called the Montpellier Codex, and this very much is a sort of bridging manuscript. It was compiled in the 14th century, but it contains music right from the Palatine period all the way into the 14th century. So we get a whole range of sort of 200 years of different notational styles going through it, which makes it a very interesting manuscript. One of the ways that it's also interesting is, at least in this example, how the format has changed. So before we were looking at F here, all of these parts go along and they're next to each other and they go along at once with one line of text at the bottom, all at the same time in one system. Well, here that is called a score format. Mm-hmm. Here we have what's called a choir book format. So if you look at this example on the right here, this whole block here, from the second staff down to the second staff up, is one part with its own text. And then on the other side of this opening, there'll be another part, similar size to this. And then the third part, which is the tenor, runs along the bottom, all the way along the same system, the bottom system for this page and the bottom system for the next page. So there's 3 parts to this thing, one here, same on the other side, and then the tenor running along the bottom. And this is a choir book format.
3 people huddled around the same book.
Exactly. Yeah.
Lovely.
Yeah, and often these are bigger volumes for that reason, because you have to huddle around it.
Makes sense.
So then we meet this our friend Franco of Cologne. There are actually 2 Francos in this period. There's a Parisian one and one of Cologne. The Cologne Franco is much more interesting, however, for our purposes, because he wrote a treatise called the Ars Cantus Mensurabilis, which sets a number of principles that are going to endure into the 17th century and even for some of them up to today. What's interesting about him is he used largely the same symbols and the same signs as the Notre Dame school did, but he where with the Notre Dame school, as I said, these the rhythmic value is notated entirely by its context over a long period of time. Well, long by an audio standards anyway. Franco creates a system that's free of that sort of contextual relationship, and through that he actually creates a system where notes have inherent meaning themselves rather than always in their sort of collection of ligatures. And this is an idea that's taken on by Petrus de Cruce at the end of the century, and he kind of then creates a system where we have individual types of notes. We have a longer, a brevis, and a semibrevis, and these have relationships to each other individually. So, where in the Parisian period you kind of have just the one note head that has that is pretty much the same throughout, but the difference between them is based on the context. Now we have different sorts of notes. We have a long, for example, here, and a breve here. Mm-hmm. And how we split those up is called mensuration. And this is what Petrus de Cruce started doing, was dividing up the brevis into a different number of semibreves. And so that can be either into 3 or into 2. The 3 is perfect, or so-called perfect, and the 2 is imperfect. Why is it perfect?
Because of the Holy Trinity.
Probably because of the Holy Trinity.
Probably the Holy Trinity.
Most likely. He also started using this thing called the punctus divisionis, which if I have time, will go into, but probably won't because it's already half past.
Can I have a brief stop?
Yes, please.
Tilly, who would like to know whether this type of music was always sung by men or whether some was sung by women. Sorry, you may answer that first.
If it was in the church, it's most likely by men. However, that's not always the case, because there are obviously plenty of convents and that sort of thing which only had women. So not always men, but probably mostly men.
There we go, Tilly. And also, just for our lovely American contingent who are watching, when we're talking about semibreves, what are we talking about?
Well, semibreves in modern American lingo would be whole notes, and breves would be double whole notes. You'll see what as we go through this, why I think that's an imperfect way of defining them.
Political assumption there.
But
anyway, we'll carry on.
But yes, to translate, semibreves are whole notes, and breves are double whole notes, and then I'll translate as we go along as well. But. Cool. So there's a really interesting manuscript here called the Roman de Fauvet, and this is compiled in the second part of it is compiled in 1314. And it marks the end of the Ars Antiqua, although of course they wouldn't know that at the time because they had no idea that there was an Ars Nova about to come. But it was the end of what we call the Ars Antiqua. And this is essentially an epic French romantic poem about a horse.
Oh, right.
And yeah, and into this poetry is interspersed many pieces of polyphony, 169 pieces of polyphony, most of which are in Latin, some of which are in French.
All about a horse?
Mostly about a horse.
Right.
Yes, mostly about a horse.
Okay. Here we go.
And I'm going to play a section of it here, so it's not wonderful quality, but I'm going to play a section of it here. This is the upper part of 2 that we're going to hear. It's quite a dramatic rendering of it. But when we're going through this, I'll follow through with my cursor, but it would be, what I would like you to do is just have a look as we go through the individual shapes of the notes and what that means for their rhythmic meaning, rhythmic duration. Okay. And there we go, off the end of the slide. Good. So so you can see here that that we have we now have different note shapes meaning different things. So this is an example of a semibreve here, and this is of a breve, or a whole note and a double whole note, if you like. And that's going to become foundational, really, for notation as it progresses through time. And then we move into the next period, French notation. As I said, most of this was from France anyway, but this is just to delineate it from the contemporary Italian period. So there are almost as many ways of writing as there were scribes doing the writing, and particularly with the smaller note values, scribes had lots of different ways of writing them. One that did find common ground, though, was an upward stroke to distinguish a note value smaller than the semibreve, and this we're going to call the semibrevis minima, or minima, which becomes the minim, which is a half note for you Americans.
Half note for the Americans, yes.
Now this practice was fairly common amongst scribes, but it wasn't codified in theory until Philip de Vitry came along at sort of the middle towards the end of the 14th century. And what he did was make the semibreve and the minim discrete units independent from the brevis. And so now, as the brevis can be broken down into 3 or 2 semibreves, the perfect number or the imperfect number, so now also the semibreve can be broken down into 3 or to 2 minims. And we'll come back to this in a moment, but the relationship between the brevis and the semibrevis is called the tempus, and the relationship between the semibrevis and the minima is called the prolation or the prolatio. And that will be very important when it comes to the slide but one. In the meantime, I'm just going to finish off with Philip de Vitry. He also established an equality that hadn't existed thus far between perfect and imperfect forms. And perfect was seen as, before Philip de Vitry, was seen as a purer way of writing music, and imperfect a less pure one. Well, he established the equality of the both, and actually the imperfect would go on to take over and become dominant in a way that that for us we can't imagine splitting up a semibreve into 3 minims. It always splits up into 2. Well, that's an imperfect form, and that's what will take over. He also less popularly introduced mensuration signs. That's little signs at the beginning, like time signatures at the beginning of a piece to tell the singers what particular mensuration they were in, which I'm going to get to what that means in a second. But that was less popular, and it took another century to catch on. On a side note, because we're talking and dealing now with lots of smaller note values, and these are being used more and more frequently. You'll notice, for example, this piece of Machaut here, which is from the mid 14th century, has many more semibreves and minims than breves, whereas before we are dealing mostly in breves and longs. So where are we? So the number of small notes means that actually our sort of perception of the beat unit has changed from Peritan when it was a long, through Franco when it was a breve, and now we're in a semi-breve beat unit. What today is a crotchet or a quarter note. That's just an interesting aside. But have we got time to play this? What time is it?
This is the most beautiful one, so
yeah.
I think we should definitely play
this. This is a gorgeous ballade by Machaut, and it's just a really nice example of this. I'll just play the first verse, and here we go. And that goes on for another few verses. In fact, down here is the text for the next 3 verses. But it's a really nice piece, that.
That is my favourite of all the pieces.
So we now have a new period. Dum-ba-da-bum. In the middle of the 15th century. Well, actually, I'll back up a little bit. So, ink and pigment is very expensive at the time, and it also happens that paper, the paper production process has got more advanced, and so paper is now thinner in the 15th century than the parchments and the vellums were of previous centuries, and so that they can support less of the weight of the ink than they used to be able to. And so to save ink, both in terms of cost and in terms of the thinner paper, in the middle of the 15th century, scribes started leaving note heads blank and not filling them in. Now, what that means is, in notational terms, not much. It looks very different, but it means the same thing fundamentally. It's a practical thing, the reason that scribes did this, but also what makes it a convenient sort of waypoint is that most of the notational developments have happened now. So if you can think of sort of blacknote notation that we've got up from 900 up to now 1450 as a sort of historical process, now things are fairly codified. And so from now to 1600, we're really going to talk about what those rules are and how they relate to the singers as well. Actually, yes, and another thing that happens in the sort of codification of the rules is that now not everything in terms of rhythm can be derived from the context of the note. Now things like the mensuration signs, which we saw Philip de Vitry introducing about 100 years ago, now they actually become essential because a collection of notes can mean more than one thing based on its mensuration, and that's what we're going to get onto now.
Oof.
So, this fun table. We've actually just talked about this. We talked about the breve unit, or the double whole unit, being split up into variously 3 or 2 semibreves, or whole notes. And also the fact that the semibreve can then be split up into 3 or into 2 minims. Well, that, if you add all the possibilities together, that gives us 4 different types of mensuration. At the tempus level, which is this level here, we have tempus perfectum for 3, or tempus imperfectum for 2. And then we also have prolatio perfecta for 3 and imperfecta for 2. There's a lot of Latin. I said there's a lot of Latin in this. But this is basically what the modern equivalent of these meters is. We have a compound triple meter here, 9/8. We have a simple triple meter here in 3/4. We have a compound duple meter here, and then a simple duple meter in 2/4. And those have, all 4 of these different mensurations has their own sign. Really, this is just 2 signs combined. The circle is for the tempus level, and so you either have a full circle for perfect tempus or a half circle for an imperfect tempus, and you have a dot or absence of a dot for the perfect prolation or imperfect prolation. Now, if all that sounds like a lot of Latin, it is.
It is a lot of Latin. Yes.
And it took me ages to get my head around that. But if you forget all those words, it doesn't matter. The point is that things can be split up differently, either into 2s or into 3s. And that will create some interesting things as we go later on. So as I just said, these notes now have a value that varies depending on the prevailing marking, the prevailing mensuration marking, and that's as opposed to the square note period where the values were sort of inbuilt into the notes themselves. Now the values are built into the system, and the notes are merely vehicles in that system for telling you how long things should be sung. Another benefit of mensuration for the composers of the time was the fact that the tempo of each individual breve was pretty fixed for this period. You had a pretty regular tactus or tempo for a breve, and so in order to make things sound faster or slower, then composers could use more or fewer smaller note values. So if you have a piece that's split up into lots and lots of minims, that is going to sound more quick than a piece that's mostly in semibreves or breves. And so the mensuration markings, which alter how many minims, for example, you can fit in to a given breve, are sort of then the tempo markings of their day. I think we're not going to talk about the dots because they get into a whole other realm that
lots of maths,
and Latin, basically. But maybe I'll save that for another, even more geeky lecture. But suffice to say, there are two dots that you'll see next to note heads. Those two dots look the same, but they're not. They do opposite things, and it will depend on the context. But I'm not going to go into that right now. Just as an example of what I meant about the same music meaning different things, here's an example. Here's 4 renditions of the same piece here, the same section of notes here, rendered with different mensural signs. Now, don't worry too much about what the lines through or the threes mean. It's not important that you particularly get exactly why this has happened into this particular format, but just suffice it to say that this here is derived from the same notes as this is here. It just has a different marking at the beginning. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So that will provide some interest as we get to proportion later on. In the meantime, just as a stopgap to proportion, we're going to talk about coloration. This is a bit of a whistle-stop tour through the rules and regulations of mensural notation. If you want to read more, then I'll put up a couple of books that you can go and find, or a couple of links, because you can get really into it. Where's that?
Can I just add, Hannah, for your essay, that might be a great source of reasons why historical. What was your title? Something about how significant the history of Western music notation is.
Oh, well, very is the example.
Very
is the answer to that. But I was thinking you're probably going to give more than just the one word. Anyway,
Probably.
This is the book to go to if you really want to get into it. It's called The Notation of Polyphonic Music by Willy Appel. Okay, so we are going to talk about coloration. Now, this is derived from the term that was... Well, this is the term that was originally used in the 14th century to describe notes that were written in a different ink. This is still in the black note notation, remember. This is why I've got this example here. Those notes was written in a different ink, different colour ink, to signify that they had a different metrical difference from the black notes that came either side of them. So, for example, this is the Old Hall manuscript, which is currently now kept in Cambridge, and you can see all these red bits here, these red notes. Well, they have each breve there will have a different value to the breve that's written in black ink. It happens to be that those are actually a coloured note loses 1/3 of its value.
Is that specific to this piece, or is that just as a general?
That's a rule.
Right. Okay.
So in white note notation, this is what it looks like. It's just colouring in, basically. So these here are 2 breves, 2 void breves is what we call them, because they haven't got any filling in them. And then we have 3 then blackened or coloured breves. And what that means is that then these 3 breves take up the same amount of time as those 2 unblackened breves would be, which ends up looking like this. So 2 minims and then a triplet of 3 minims. Same happens with the semi-breve. So two two normal semibreves in white note notation mean the same thing as three coloured or blackened semibreves, like that, and then same with the minim. These here are not crotchets. Don't be fooled. They're not crotchets. They are blackened minims. So they have the same value as 2/3 of a minim. I told you that it was going to get a lot of maths, which is why I'm not going too deep into it. There's plenty of resources if you want to go deep into it, but I'm just giving you an overview of that. But don't get fooled. That's not a crotchet. That is a blackened minim. That's enough on coloration.
You had enough.
Finally, in this, we're going to look in this sort of talk, this survey. We're going to look at proportion. Proportion really is the sort of game playing of the composers of the 15th century, and it's what I mean by proportion is that when composers use different mensurations in different parts at the same time. So you might have the tenor singing in a perfect mensuration and the soprano singing in an imperfect one at the same time. It gets really confusing. This is a characteristic trait of the Flemish school, and there's plenty of examples of that. However, it does appear in a form in some of the clausulae that we looked at the beginning of the 13th century of Peritin. It's not the same form because it don't have the quite the same mensuration rules that we do in the 15th century, but it does have that's just to show that it does have history. And so you can then have, as I said, you can have different mensurations going on at different times, and you can play around with those as a composer by employing a canon. Now, a canon doesn't mean the same thing as it does today. Today, the word canon has a fairly tightly defined, it has a fairly narrow definition of a piece of music that happens twice, starting at a different point, exactly the same. That doesn't happen in this period. That's not what that means in this period. Canon here just means rule, and in the same way that canon law, for example, is church law. And what that means is it's any instruction to the singer that they should be doing something that they wouldn't have ordinarily thought about doing without that instruction there. If that all sounds terribly complicated, it'll be even more complicated by this. So this is a mass setting by Jacob Obrecht, and this is the tenor part. This is the Missa Si Dedero, and this is the tenor part. Now this is the entire mass, bar the last Agnus, which happens on the next page. This is the entire mass on one page. By contrast, the soprano part, or the descanters part for this, takes 9 pages. Now, why is this so compact? Well, you'll see here that at the start of each section, we have more than one mensuration marking.
Oof, okay.
Sometimes as many as 4. And at the end of each section, we have a repeat mark. Now, I think you can see where this is going. So, for example, this opening of the Sanctus section here, you'd have to sing this through in the top mensuration first.
So that's
perfect, and then perfect, imperfect for this half.
Okay.
And then repeat it all again in the next mensuration down. The same notes, but just in a different mensuration. So they're going to have different values. And then do the same thing again a third time before you get to the double bar. What makes this even more interesting is the Sanctus even more interesting, is that you have more than one mensuration for each round through, so you're actually going to end up singing 6 different mensurations. Whereas with most,
all different
with
each of the parts, right?
Well, this is only in the tenor this happens.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Gotcha. So only in the tenor this happens. Everyone else has a single mensuration for the whole thing, and they don't repeat as well. They just go through one long line.
Wow.
So this is going to be a challenge for me as well. I'm going to play the Sanctus. This is about 3.5 minutes, so it'll just take us nicely to 3 o'clock. And it's just all we're going to do is get from here to here, and it's going to go through this 3 times, And the first time, because we're in a perfect mensuration, it's going to be very slow, but I'll follow along with the cursor. And then as we go through, it gets more quick. So actually these two here are quite fast. You'll see what I mean.
Okay.
So try and follow. It's quite, the tenor is quite low in the mix, so it's quite hard to follow the part, but see if you can. I'll do it with the cursor as well. All right, good luck everyone. These are rests, by the way. And that's 1600. So that's a bit of fun. The singers would have spent many years learning how to do this. It's not like if you can't read that straight away, then that's absolutely normal. Well done, because it takes a lot of practice. In fact, I don't think I'd be able to read that even having studied it straight off. So there we go. That's the end of the period. Was there any questions that you haven't answered yet?
None outstanding, I don't think. Just a
Sweet.
lot about whether men would have been singing this other than women, but I think you've covered that. So
Yeah, I think so. Even in the 16th century, it's largely but not exclusively men. Yeah, I think that's a fair answer. Yeah.
pretty decent.
Well, I hope you found that interesting. Maybe if we're still in this in a few weeks' time, then I'll take up 1600 up to now, which presents some different challenges. But who knows? Anyway, hope you all have a very safe, very happy Easter weekend. Happy Easter to everyone, and see you again soon. This was Live from Home.
Bye, guys.